So, today we are talking about two books, both by Lindy Ryan, Bless Your Heart, and its sequel, Another Fine Mess. So, I loved these books. I'm just going to get that right out of the way. I loved these books. I've got them on audiobook and listened to them twice now, and just fell in love really from the teaser description of, the opening sort of bits of the first book. These are, I suppose they're Southern Gothic. They're definitely Southern. They're set in a little town in Texas. They are Gothic in the sense that they are, they're about monsters. The Strigoi, the risen dead, who are this sort of wonderful mashup between a zombie and a vampire, depending upon, I think, its sort of level of development, and a Pricolici, which is, I'm not even sure what this thing is. It's got sort of werewolf-like qualities, but it also is more than that. But yeah, and is also risen from the dead. So, wonderful sort of monster stories in very real sense. We do get a little bit of a ghost here and there, but not much. Really just one, and just briefly toward the end of the second book. Without going into, I'm going to make this as spoiler free as possible. But to give you a sense of what these books are like, for me, it was as if Practical Magic and Buffy the Vampire Slayer got together. That was my sort of instinctive, whoa, these stories. And as I mentioned in my video on this cursed house, I am in the market for looking for Southern Gothic novels, largely because my work in progress is a Southern Gothic set in modern day Florida. And so I've been, trying to read more modern day Southern Gothics. We tend to think of, sort of older, sort of William Faulkner and people like that when we talk about the Southern Gothic. Great stories, great novels from the earlier 20th century, mid 20th century. Absolutely go find them and read them. You will not regret it. But there's also modern Southern Gothic. And even though this technically, I suppose, is a period novel, though it's hard for me to think of 1999 as a period setting, but it is 27 years ago as at the time of this recording, so it is period. There are full-grown people who were not alive in 1999, so I guess that's what getting older is suddenly the time periods that feel like 10 years ago are not. But I digress. But yeah, so these are set, as I say, 1999, a little town in Texas, and it centers around a family of four women, the great-grandmother Ducey, the grandmother Lenore, the mother Grace, and the daughter, who is 15, Luna, and they are the Evans women. And the Evans women, ever since Ducey's mother, Pye, in the distant past, they have been the sort of the funeral home. They have been the undertakers of their community, and it's not an accident that they have taken to this profession. Luna finds out early on in the first novel, and this is how we are, we have this world explained to us and the circumstances of these women's lives explained to us, that they are undertakers because it has fallen to them for whatever reason, and we never really get a full explanation. At least in the first two books, we get some very strong hints and some suppositions about why this fate has fallen to this family, but nothing 100% concrete. That the women of the Evans family are fated to keep a watch out, an eye out for the dead, so that if and when, and it really is a matter of when the dead will rise, the Evans women, can put them down. And they tend to do this with blades. The Evans women are blades women, is what we are told. And they use knives, they use the tools of the undertaker's trade to do this. And they don't embalm. Embalming makes it worse for whatever reason. They don't know. But it is their job to, when the dead rise, and they have theories, but they don't know for sure why the dead rise, why some people rise and some don't. I think it's down to the suddenness and the violence of the death, although it's hard to say for sure. But their job is to put these people back in the grave when they rise. And when Luna, finds all this out, we then, of course, find it out with her. Although we know a bit more than she does. We're privy to some scenes earlier in the first novel, in Bless Your Heart, that she is not. And this is what helps us to understand the circumstances under which the Evans women have to operate, and why they do what they do. And the town, is full of wonderful characters, although we mostly, in the first book, hear about Sheriff Buck Johnson, Deputy Roger Taylor, and his I guess deputy, his underling, Officer Hanson. We hear a little bit about Luna's friends, Dylan and Crystal, and we get to know them, and a boy who arrives on the scene and becomes first part of her school, then very quickly part of her friend group, and that is Crane Campbell. And he is a very sort of mysterious kind of goth guy who has moved to Texas from Colorado, and this is shortly in the aftermath of the Columbine massacre at Columbine High School. And the way he dresses, the way he presents himself, he comes across to a lot of the kids as if he were a part of the so-called trenchcoat mafia, who are associated with the boys who actually undertake that massacre. If you don't know about the Columbine High massacre, go and have a look at that. You can easily find out about it online, and it's an ugly story. I will say that. So that kind of ugliness underlies what's happening in sort of Crane's reputation, but he is not like that. That is a bit of a spoiler. He's okay. He's actually a pretty good guy, Crane, and he very quickly sort of attaches himself to Luna. We also hear about, and her name changes in its pronunciation on the audiobooks between the first and the second novel. In the first novel's audiobook, she is Snow Ledger. In the second, she is Snow Leger. She dies early on, but since this is a book about the risen dead, we're not done with her for a while, and she's sort of mentioned numerous times throughout the books. And she's sort of the locals' hairdresser, and we get all these Dylan's sister Kim Cole, who becomes particularly important in the second novel, Another Fine Mess. But what we get is essentially the story of these women, their role in the town, the sort of curse as they see it that has forced them into this position of not just undertakers, but guardians of their community, guardians against the risen dead, against the Strigoi. They refer quite frequently, although it takes us a while to find out what this is, to, quote, that god-awful mess that happened 15 years ago. And that god-awful mess is actually hugely important to the events of Bless Your Heart, particularly the climax of Bless Your Heart, and to the events of Another Fine Mess, where, amongst other things, and I'm trying to think how to do this without being spoilery, which is probably going to make this episode a pretty short one because I really just want to tell you the whole story, and I'm trying not to because I want you to go and read this and discover it for yourself. But, we're introduced to these incredibly, and then get to know very well these incredibly eccentric, quirky, and I know that sounds redundant. It really isn't. There are differences between, I think, eccentric and quirky. Quirky is that you have some little odd things about you. Eccentric is that your whole way of living is unusual. That's how I would differentiate them anyway. And these women are both eccentric and quirky. And although we don't hear much from Pi, the sort of progenitor of this line of women and the circumstances of their lives, we do a bit more in the second book than in the first. Pi, Ducey's mother, is mentioned frequently because she goes to her grave without giving, as far as they know, everything they need to know in order to understand what's going on. They don't understand why the dead rise. They know from experience how to put them down, how to stop them from rising again, but sometimes it's hard to spot the signs. They do know that eventually the dead make their way to the parlor, but they don't know why. And they don't know why this has happened in the first place, why this bothers their town. We do more or less come to find that out, what has happened. And honestly, without being too spoilery, little teeny spoiler, it is very much connected with the Texan oil industry, and honestly has an incredibly environmentalist, slant message, and it is essentially, although the women that we are following, and even Pi, because when this happens, Pi is a very young girl. We're sort of given the impression that she's still actually a child when the events that startled us in motion actually happen, even though it's not their fault, and even though it's connected with, sort of men's greed and the riches that they think they're going to tap into and that they keep extracting. It may not be their fault, but they're the ones who have to deal with it. It's unfortunately their mess to clean up. So it's a bit, the sins of the father kind of thing. Though not necessarily directly their ancestor. This would have been Ducey, the great-grandmother's grandfather, who is the actual adult involved in all of this. As I say, her mother, Pi, was still a child. But even he, as we come to find out, was not nearly as greedy, nearly as involved as other local men. But it falls to these Evans women nonetheless to do this. And Pi did it. She taught these skills to her daughter and what she knew to her daughter and passed this down to her. Ducey has done the same for her daughter Lenore. Lenore has done the same for her daughter Grace. And now it is Grace's turn, although she, of course, has her mother, her grandmother, assisting her and supporting her in all of this, to introduce everything to her daughter, Luna. And it's through Luna that we get to know a little bit more of the town, but it is also through the other women. Because even though they spend most of their time at the funeral home, even though they are kind of shunned, or at least, kept at a distance by the majority of their community, who don't necessarily know what's going on. And this is something I always love, is this idea that the world as we know it is exactly as we know it, but, and it's a big but, there's this other side of it that most of us have no idea about. It's that sort of hidden knowledge, that idea that the world is more magical and more mystical than we may realize. And in these stories, it is more magical and mystical in some very dangerous, gruesome, gory ways. And I will say there is occasionally some gore, just as a warning. We get descriptions of victims who have been attacked and killed by sort of zombie-like, vampiric-like creatures. But these are not zombies who only want brains. They'll take any bit of blood, any bit of whatever that they can get. And we do get some pretty gruesome scenes. And even one of the characters, Officer Hansen, the youngest of the police, these are so horrible that he vomits on a number of occasions when he sees the crime scenes. Deputy Taylor, or later Sheriff Taylor, he too is increasing. I don't think he ever actually throws up. I don't recall him actually throwing up, but he comes very close. And whereas at the beginning of the first book, before he knows what's happening for real in the town, it's sort of commented that he's got a little bit of a gut. But by the start of the second book, where we get a parallel scene of him going to the local cafe to get a coffee and some pastry, he's lost that gut, and he doesn't even want to eat the bit of pastry that he thinks maybe I can handle this. So, think there is some gore. It's not constant. It's not so bad. It's not good, but it's not so bad. So just as a bit of a warning, if you can't handle it at all, then you now know that there is some. But if it's not your thing, but you can sit through a couple of minutes of that, then go for it. You can always skip the worst bits if you want. They're not. The detail is not gratuitous, but it is not 100% necessary either. It's more about knowing how vicious and how destructive these things are, rather than plot pointy, usually. Anyway, but yeah, it's almost impossible to say too much without spoilers, and I don't want to spoil this. These books were so much fun, and honestly, and as I say, I've now listened to them twice on audiobook. Even the second time around, knowing what happened. I didn't listen to them immediately. It was several months later that I've re-listened to them. But, so I didn't remember 100% of everything, but I remembered well enough. And even at that, it didn't ruin the experience. It actually was more fun in some ways, because I knew what Ducey and Lenore and Grace knew, and got to sort of be sitting there with them as they introduce Luna to the finer points of their world and their duty. And you sort of think at first, well, isn't that kind of, because there's a little part of me that was thinking at first, isn't it a shame that, in a way, Luna doesn't have a choice any more than Grace had a choice, or that Lenore had a choice, that they have to sort of follow in their family footsteps. That they'll always be in this little town. They'll always have to work at the funeral home. And I think sometimes I'm a little sensitive to this, because, all right, I don't know how long whether they still do these or not, but certainly when I was a kid, we had to do career aptitude tests. And mine said that I should be a funeral director. Spoiler alert, I was never a funeral director, and I have zero plans to become a funeral director, and I honestly don't think I would have the stomach for being a funeral director. I certainly don't have, I couldn't do that. Maybe other aspects of it, but certainly not that part of it. So, there was a part of me was, as Luna's sort of finding out that she one day will be working at the funeral home, that she will have to be a part of this legacy. There was, that sort of, well, really fair because I'm, oh God, I wouldn't have wanted that. But as it turns out, Luna is actually very well suited for it, and she's going to be fine. So we don't need to worry about her. But it is about that idea of legacy, of duty, of responsibility, and you know, it has, and yet with all of that, with all the monsters, with all of that, those sort of heavy ideas of death and what death means, what curses mean, what, as I say, the ultimate, as far as we know, what we know does suggest strongly that the reasons for this curse on this town is because of the greed of the town residents' ancestors, and that does include the Evans women. But at the same time, these are delightfully funny, charming books. They're full of great, great humor, incredibly vividly drawn characters. You get to know these women, and they are as real as, the people that you know in your own life. They are incredibly well developed. And I am going to say my very favorite of all of them is Juicy. Juicy is. She is hard nosed, but she is incredible. And she's, a straight shooter. She is incredibly practical, but she adores her family, and she will do whatever it takes to keep them safe, to make sure they know what they need to know. And that includes knowing how to do the terrible, awful things that they sometimes have to do in order to A, stay alive, and B, fulfill their cosmic duty to the town. So, yeah, this is a short one this week. And the moral of the story is go read Bless Your Heart and Another Fine Mess if you like, which I'm not normally a monster story kind of person, but in this case, I really enjoyed them. And they definitely borrow from particularly sort of European folklore in terms of the kind of monsters that are within them, but they do it in their own way. But go read these books. They are so much fun. The characters are incredibly evocative. The storyline, the plot is, it unfolds beautifully across the two books. They are just wonderful. They really are. And you won't regret it. It is well worth your time. And fingers crossed, there will be a third on Lindy Ryan's website. She does have, the Bless Your Heart series. She has the first two pictured, and then there's space visually for a third book cover to be included. But so fingers crossed, because the way it ends, it could end there, or it could carry on to a third book. And there's, I'm sure there's more to this world. To the world of these women, particularly as they sit in 1999, the second half of 1999, on the cusp of the new millennium. I'm sure that, amongst other things, Y2K could offer the poor Evans women, yet another god-awful mess to deal with. So, that's all for today. Short and sweet this time. Hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you next week for another episode. Bye.